Hesiod relates in his Theogony that once the ruler of all the gods was Cronus. Out of fear he ate his children so that none of them could take his throne. Then when the mother of Zeus had given birth, she fed Cronus a rock in place of her infant son and brought him in secret to Crete. But once Zeus had fulfilled his destiny, Cronus was forced to vomit up his other children along with that very rock which he had been fed. And according to Hesiod, this stone was placed in the valleys of Parnassus for humankind to marvel at, a warning of how futile it is to resist divine destiny. The invading Persian army walked through this valley, taking no heed of the warning of the god, and as Herodotus tells us, rocks came tumbling down upon them from the summits of Parnassus, doing great violence to his troops and portending, as believed the Greeks, their ultimate doom. For in the naval battle of Salamis, Plutarch writes, "In the middle of the fight a great flame rose into the air from Eleusis, and that the sounds and voices were heard through all the Thracian plain as far as the sea, and that a mist seemed to form and rise from the place from whence the sounds came and fell upon the galleys, which was, as Herodotus adds, as though raised by a force of about 30,000 men on the march, relating to us an event by which we might imagine the ghosts of past initiate heroes hearkening to the threat and rising from their eternal rest to consecrate the defenders of holy Hellas, a great victory in their hour of need. But the Persian war was not yet finished, for Xerxes would leave 300,000 men behind to winter in Thessaly and march towards Athens the following year, and it was at the Battle of Plataea where a Greek coalition force under the Spartan general Pausanias would meet this last Persian thrust. But as the enemy advanced against the Greeks, Plutarch writes, Pausanias, offering sacrifice, could not procure favorable omens, and so commanded the Lacedaemonians, setting down their shields at their feet, to abide quietly and attend his directions, making no resistance to any of their enemies. No Spartan could defend himself, while Pausanias was taking these divinations in the middle of the battle. And Plutarch writes, the case was indeed hard, and the forbearance of the men wonderful, for they let the enemy charge without repelling them, and expecting their proper opportunity from the gods, and their general suffered themselves to be wounded and slain in their ranks, and their faith would be rewarded. And in an incredible episode of history, the Greeks would achieve victory and reap the spoils of the Persian army that they would completely eradicate. So the seriousness that the Spartans attached to divination can be seen in the story leading up to how they hired the seer. The person who took the divinations was someone named Tysimenous. And according to Herodotus, this man early in his life had consulted the oracle. And he says, the Pythia replied that he would win the greatest contests, 5 of them in fact. The Lacedaemonians realized that the prophecy to Tysimenous referred to military contests, and they tried to bribe him to lead them in war. That's how seriously they took this. And the story goes that Tysimenous was able to demand Spartan citizenship for both himself and his brother in exchange for this help, which was a big deal because, as Herodotus says, these two were the only people we know of who ever were made Spartan citizens. And so he conducts the sacrifices. And Herodotus writes, the sacrificial omens for the Hellenes were favorable if they fought to defend themselves, but not if they crossed the Asopos and initiated battle. And what is interesting is that the Persians took these seriously as well. And Herodotus continues, the sacrifices conducted for Mardonius, and that's the Persian general, also turned out to be adverse if he were eager to initiate battle, but favorable if he fought in self-defense. And so these armies sit across from each other for 10 days, not wanting to initiate battle, and Mardonius has to go on the offensive because he's running out of food. And when the battle does happen, we can wonder at the psychological value of believing in divine destiny. These are the lines from Plutarch. While Pausanias was thus in the act of supplication, the sacrifices appeared propitious, and the soothsayers foretold victory. The word being given, the Lacedaemonian battalion of foot seemed on the sudden like some one fierce animal setting up its bristles and betaking himself to the combat, and the barbarians perceived that they encountered with men who would fight to the death. Those are the words that Plutarch uses to describe the ferocity with which the Spartans fought under the belief that the omens were propitious. It seems additionally significant to the Greeks that the sacrifices only turned favorable once Pausanias looked up to the temple of Hera with a genuine feeling of supplication and humility in his heart. Only then did the sacrifices become good, which is in keeping with some lines from Pindar in Olympian 8, where he writes, "Men's prayers are fulfilled in return for piety." And now the Spartans seem to have had a unique relationship with all things relating to superstition of any kind. And we can see this in the story of the Battle of Marathon back in 490 BC, when the Athenians sent a runner, the first ever marathon runner, arrived at Sparta saying, "Come help us fight this battle." And this is what Herodotus says. When he had announced this, as he had been instructed, the Spartans resolved to help the Athenians, but it was impossible for them to do so at that moment, since they did not wish to break their law, for that day was the 9th of the month, and on the 9th, they said, they could not march out to war, but must instead wait until the moon was full. And that's why they missed the Battle of Marathon. The Spartans did indeed send an army, and it got there late. So returning to the Battle of Plataea, all of the Greek forces were under the command of Pausanias because he was the Spartan general and Sparta was the most important city. But the Athenian contingent was under the command of Aristides, and he sent for his own oracle, and Plutarch writes, "The god answered that the Athenians should overcome their enemies if they fought within their own territories in the plain of Ceres, Eleucina, and Proserpina." And since the oracle stated that the Athenians had to fight within their own territories in order to win, the Plataean general, who had been visited by Jupiter in a dream, made a decision, and Plutarch continues, that the oracle might be accomplished in all particulars. The Plataeans decreed that the frontiers of their country towards Attica should be removed, and the land given to the Athenians, that they might fight in defense of Greece in their own proper territory. The Plataeans were so receptive to oracular authority that they conceded part of their land to Athens in order to align the circumstances with what the oracle proclaimed. And if we read from the rest of what Plutarch says about this divination for the Athenians, he says this, and from these lines we get a real sense of the spirituality of ancient Greece. Here are the lines. "The god answered that the Athenians should overcome their enemies in case they made supplication to Jupiter and Juno of Kithaeron, Pan, and the nymphs Sphrygites. And the cave of the nymphs Sphrygites was on the top of Mount Kithaeron, on the side facing the setting sun of summertime, in which place, as the story goes, there was formerly an oracle, and many that lived in the district were inspired with it, whom they called nympholepti, possessed with the nymphs." So I include these lines for those who feel there's a certain romance to the ancient Greeks, but also to highlight the seriousness of what was sacred, and looking at this amphora, depicting what seems to be a much more individualized act of divination. The writer François Lissérag tells us that this is a rare but revealing motif, that of divination, and that such a reverent image should appear on an amphora, which, as Lissérag tells us, is the vessel in which the Greeks carried their wine, suggests to me that the Greeks of the 500s BC abided with a certain sacramental attentiveness and religious observance. And in this crater from 420 BC, the artist shows the greatest warrior of all, that great demigod Heracles, as having disarmed himself and dressed in the simple clothes of ritual sacrifice as he gestures for his animal offering to be led towards the altar. It was beneath no one to show deference and reverence to the gods. So who were these seers? Who were the soothsayers? So in some cases they were families who dwelled in or near these shrines, such as the Eomids, who were responsible for the oracle at Mount Kronos, whose origins are described by Pindar in his 6th Olympian ode. But more interesting is the story reported in Book 9 of Herodotus. And this story is efficient for us to use because it pertains to a battle that apparently took place on the same day as Plataea, across the Aegean Sea at Mycale in Ionia. And yet again, the Greek forces employed a seer and were victorious. Herodotus tells us, serving as their seer was Diphonos, son of Eunios, a man from Apollonia. and his father, Unius, had become a seer, and Herodotus narrates the story as follows. In this Apollonia there are flocks sacred to Helios. Unius was guarding them, as he had been chosen to do. But one night he fell asleep during his watch, and some wolves got past him and entered the cave, where they killed about 60 of the flock. The Apollonians noticed what had happened, and having discovered it, they brought him before a court, which condemned him to be deprived of his sight. As soon as Unius was blinded, the flock ceased to give birth, and the earth did not bear crops as it had before. At Dodona and Delphi, the Apollonians asked about the cause of their current evils, and received word from the gods in response that Unius had been unjustly deprived of his sight, for it was the gods themselves who had set the wolves on their flocks, and they would continue to seek vengeance for Unius until the Apollonians paid the penalty for what they had done. And after the Apollonians gave him some property, Herodotus concludes, afterward he, as in Unius, immediately became possessed of the power of innate divination, so that he became very famous. So the point of this story could be that the gift of divination was bestowed upon a man who was the victim of human presumption. The elements in this story are that the Apollonians erroneously presumed that Unius could be blamed for the loss of their sheep, that they did great wrong to him in taking away his sight, and that they only knew the error of their ways after a divine revelation, and only then did they repent of the injury they had done, and their victim, as a result, became a prophet. So let us take that portion of intellectual contemplation that we would otherwise devote to refuting the possibility of divination, and apply it to absorbing the real lesson it contains, that those acts we characterize as justice, undertaken with what we might think is factual understanding, carried out in mass with the charge and urgency of a single moment, could well be actions that are driven by what is false, and having done them, find ourselves perpetrators of what is wrong. The real miracle performed by the Apollonians was no act of divination, but it is the fact that a living generation, rather than heap abuse upon the sins of their fathers, considered its own actions, and while still alive themselves, made atonement.